following up on the discussion or introduction rather of the new syntactic structure of the constitutive statements in IG 2.0, we are now looking at the reconciliation of the constitutive statements with the levels of expressiveness as introduced for IG 2.0 more generally. My name is Christopher Franz from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and I'm working here as an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science. And I'm joined by
Seba Siddiqui, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public Administration and International Affairs at Syracuse University.
So if we look at this topic of the constitutive statements more specifically, we quickly realize that we have introduced a new syntax, but have not yet integrated this into or integrated this with the different levels of expressiveness that have been introduced in the context of regulatory institutional statements.
So now turning to the levels of expressiveness for constitutive statements, we of course see correspondence to the level association that's introduced for regulatory statements specifically. For IG core, we assumed ontological consistency and the removal of any possible ambiguity with respect to association as a key criterion, whereas IG extended seeks detailed modeling, fine-grained modeling by decomposing selected components specifically, and Logico, of course, puts a semantic twist or lens rather on the institutional statements as encoded. So looking at constitutive statements, and of course the syntax as a baseline here, we'll find that IG core does not go beyond extending or characterizing properties for particular components of this syntax, specifically the constituting properties, so those themselves may have properties, as well as the constituted entity, which in itself also may have properties. In addition, we find of course, the activation conditions and execution constraints that were treated in equivalence to the regulatory side, and we of course also find statement level nesting in the or else as introduced also in the regulatory side and as well as in the earlier examples. So the question is then, what's the need for IG extended? And if we recall the heuristics applied for the introduction of additional features on different levels, we don't need to look far, but can just look at statements that we commonly find. And this one is such an example. So we have a notification that is characterized based on its content. So a notification shall provide a description, let's say, of a non-compliance, facts upon which the notification is based, and certain other properties. So applying the syntax as just introduced, we'll find that we have the notification that shall, meaning the deontic is implied here, provide, it's the constitutive function, certain properties, content. And those are, of course, annotated as the property components. So this is a sensible characterization, of course, invites for the decomposition of the individual properties, so they can be individually assessed. But before doing so and moving in this direction, let's step back a bit and let us suggest the relevance of such decomposition. So fundamentally, the question is, when is such decomposition of real concern? When do we actually need to bother about it, really? And there's two elementary points that come to mind. On the one hand, it's the detailed assessment of compliance, if you like. So if you have a statement, constitutive or regulatory in kind, it is essential to understand the complete content of the institutional statement. And that means both the action that is, for example, regulated, or the activity that's regulated, as well as the substantive content of such statements that may be described in terms of constitutive statements. For example, if we characterize the submission of a notification and we want to assess the correct performance of this particular activity, meaning the sending of the notification, but also satisfying the characteristics that are associated with a notification in this particular scenario, it's important to capture the detail on the constitutive side equivalently. So, so here the key point is that we need to have a capturing of both the activity and the object. But of course, constitutive statements can also imply actions. So if they, for example, suggest deadlines to particular actions that are to be performed, then those, of course, act as constraints on a action that is, for example, expressed in a regulatory statement or not not in any other statement at all. So meaning it needs to be inferred from the constitutive statement that such constraints on the regulatory side actually exist. The alternative perspective that we can apply when deciding as to whether we need to leverage IG extended as a coding level is to look at the motivation that underlies the whole concept of IG 2.0. And that is the comprehensive ability to reconstruct institutional configurations. An aspect that we laid out in an earlier video, of course, but it implies that we need to be able to extract all the relevant components of an institutional configuration. That implies, of course, both the actions or activities as they are specified, but also artifacts again, or objects as they are specified. And since constitutive statements can transcend specific action situations, so they can relate to multiple, and in fact, probably broader than the case for regulatory statements, which are generally embedded within an action situation more specifically, it's of course relevant to treat those as, let's say, exogenous variables in the widest sense that the action situation, and more specifically, the regulatory statements draw upon for the specification and, of course, for the assessment of compliance or violation, if you like. So any comprehensive treatment there, therefore, of the institutional configuration requires the consideration of both. The other aspect is that the differentiation between constitutive and regulatory statements can be fuzzy. And this can be exemplified by the fact that you oftentimes find regulatory statement embedded, for example, in preambles, and they take the nature of, they take entertain a constitutive function in principle, but are regulatory in form. So we have this dissonance with respect to the representation, but it can also mean that regulatory statements, for example, embed a specification of an artifact or object that's relevant in the institutional context. Conversely, we can, of course, again have constitutive statements that imply certain actions or constrain those. So this fuzziness is one of the aspects that is, of course, challenging. On the other hand, coming back to our motivation to encode institutional configurations from a semantic perspective, it becomes very important to think about this, because if the characterization of constitutive and regulatory statements is not necessarily unambiguous and perhaps even of stylistic nature, certain preferences or structure as developed for a particular policy document, we could argue that the capturing institutional statement by type, here type being the constitutive or regulatory nature, may actually lead us to responding an encoding style or other preferences that a policy writer may have embedded when writing the policy in the first place, as opposed to reconstructing the institutional configuration more generally, as opposed to performing a mapping merely between the statements and the corresponding institutional statements. On the other hand, another aspect that's relevant when considering the use of IG extended on the constitutive side is, of course, in how far we're interested in specific and analytical scope. Are we interested in an institutional statement more immediately and perhaps don't need to know too much about the context or about objects, artifacts, or even actions that transcend a particular action situation? Then it may well be sensible to just simply focus on a IG core, for example, for constitutive statements. But if we want to extract the relationships between action situations and, of course, statements more generally, for example, by objects that are constituted at some stage in the policy, and, of course, to perhaps analyze and characterize the policy more generally, then it becomes necessary to consider the constitutive and regulatory side in equivalence and at eye level, if you like. And this becomes, of course, quite sensibly important if we want to embrace and model institutional complexity comprehensively. So a very central point there is to capture it as far as sensible in the first place. So Coming back to IG extended in the context of constitutive institutional statements, then more generally, well, what are the revisions that we need to consider? And we propose a selection, specifically two ones that we want to highlight, and centrally focusing on the structural decomposition of particular components. Here, particularly constituted entity, but more immediately, and that's something we will explore in the following slides, is the structural decomposition of the properties, as we just saw in the earlier motivation. In this context, we'll also introduce the concept of constitutive regulatory hybrids, as you will see, and we'll also borrow, on the IG extended level, borrow the conception of the context taxonomy and component level nesting as introduced in the context of regulatory statements. So this is equivalent to the regulatory side of the institutional grammar. But to see the motivation specifically for the structural decomposition, let's look at those aspects specifically in the upcoming slides. So building on the example we introduced earlier here, the notification that shall provide a description of non-compliance and certain other components will, of course, can simply decompose those in individual components, meaning individual properties that are logically combined. Here again, you can also make the logical relationship explicit, which may be sometimes obscured by the rather ambiguous use of, for example, or in the context of human language. But here it's very clear that we have property 1, 2, and 3 as a basis for the characterization of a notification in the first place, as annotated here. So the structural decomposition, of course, goes a bit further than this. Here, this motivating example was rather simplistic and focused on a decomposition of a list, but we'll find a richer set of decomposites, if you like, and they can vary in nature, but of course also in implied semantics to some extent. So on the one hand, of course, we have kind of simple objects that are composed, but we can often also find that there are different forms of combinations of properties that either define a entity, so they basically constitute an entity in the existential sense, so they're necessary to express the constituted entity, whereas an aggregation can be more or less a summary of particular elements contained therein. So if you think about, for example, the conception of a artifact such as a house or car, you would characterize a vehicle in a wider sense. You would identify this and constitute it based on the components you associated with this, and it would basically provide a form of composition. Whereas a mere aggregation is merely a listing of potential properties that are associated with a particular object, without necessarily constituting any novel object in its own right. And this is also related to the principles of exhaustiveness. So where some listings may be exhaustive in nature, so maybe comprehensively listing the embedded properties, in other cases it may not be the case. So we see that in human language often based on the use, for example, of etc. or aspects such as including or making it explicit that an enumeration or a listing is non-exhaustive, if you like. In addition to this, we'll find, of course, substructures. So institutional statements themselves, those decompositions of properties can in themselves, for example, contain yet another set of lists or properties that are constructed therein. This is simply based on empirical observation that we'll find and motivate in a bit. So I will not go deeper into the context annotation, which is another aspect, of course, relevant to the institutional statements on the IG extended level, since it has been covered elsewhere. But I want to talk about, of course, about the last aspect, which is the decomposition of regulatory constitutive hybrids or constitutive regulatory hybrids. So there's a bit of a simile and ambiguity in language, but we'll resolve this in a bit. So, and we recognize three forms of those. In fact, we observe situations in which regulatory statements are embedded in constitutive statements, in which case it would be considered a constitutive regulatory statement, of course, a hybrid, where the leading statement is a constitutive one and the embedded statement a regulatory one. And conversely, we may have a situation where the constitutive statement is embedded in an otherwise regulatory statement. So the leading statement there being regulatory, but embedding a constitutive function as part of the statement, as we'll see. The other aspect that we'll tackle are syntactic polymorphs. So that's an interesting feature that we introduce as part of this as well, because it's empirically observable, but it also lends analogical value, as we'll discuss at a later stage. So, but returning to the discussion more generally, starting with the decomposition of different properties initially, and moving forwards to the regulatory constitutive hybrids, we use the following example initially. So here we define the functions of a board that shall be, for example, to give effect to the decisions and policies of the health assembly, to act as an executive organ, and to perform some other functions and trustee. So this is a selection of different functions associated with this. And if we characterize those, well, this would reflect a composition of functions that the board holds. So composition here implies that the functions are on the one hand exhaustively specified, but the individual properties as characterized here in their combination are the functions that are associated with a particular board. So they're not just an aggregation of different tasks, as you like, but the functions concept or object, if you like. So it's in this case, of course, a constituted entity, but let's say if you were to use it in a context of a regulatory statement, it would be an object. This can be decomposed into those three components, and then, of course, assessed as to whether the board commits and satisfies those functions in the first place. And it's, of course, exhaustive. This is to be identified from the context, so meaning this is on an obligation or responsibility, rather, on the part of the coder to identify, based on linguistic or other signals, as to whether such a listing is exhaustive or not. So this should then be coded as follows, in equivalence to the earlier example. So in here we basically have a decomposition of the properties into individual elements that are expressed as shown here. So the question that one may ask then already, so this is just about the decomposition of properties, but the question you may quickly ask is, are we representing a truly constitutive statement? And of course, there will be a shall not shed in doubt that it actually is. We're defining functions here, so it's introducing a new concept. But on the other hand, the decomposed properties specifically have regulatory character. So they clearly identify an activity that is to be performed. You can also identify objects, for example, of different form, and of course the context, which is of course equivalent both in regulatory statement and constitutive statements. So we have this situation where we have a bit of a mixed characterization, or at least can observe this based on the syntactic patterns that are expressed in the statement. So if we are then interested in capturing structure of institutional statements in great detail, in IG Extended specifically, how do we react to this observation, the fact that it's regulatory in kind, as opposed to constitutive as the leading aspects, as specified here? Well, for this purpose, we conceive of those constitutive regulatory hybrids, if you like. And I'll just highlight the principal motivation of those. It's basically the combination of constitutive statements and regulatory statements as found in practice. So borrowing the example introduced earlier, but without further characterization of this specific relationship, we revisit those here now with the refinements introduced as part of IG Extended. So one of those includes, of course, the decomposition of the diversity now into different properties in its own right, but also the nesting specifically on the or else. So the consequence component here, the or else, is the important aspect. So if we look at a conventional constitutive statement as introduced for IG 2.0, we'll find that the consequence is specified in terms of a constitutive statement in its own Right, so following the idiomatic syntax, we find PDFAC as a leading institutional statement and PFE as a consequential statement, the fact that the plan is void if the conditions that are specified as part of the leading constitutive statement are not satisfied. So if we look at the constitutive regulatory hybrid, the second example highlighted here, also taken from the earlier set of examples, we'll find that we're truly dealing with a combination of constitutive and regulatory statements. So whereas the leading institutional statement, the first part of it, if you like, before the or else, is a constitutive statement, again, with the property decomposition as motivated earlier, we'll find that the latter one is actually a combination in this particular instance, a horizontal combination of two regulatory statements, such as the university will retract a plan or the university must send, that are oblige certain actors to perform particular actions. So here there's a practical example of a constitutive regulatory hybrid statement, as we'll find them in practice. So to motivate this further and perhaps to highlight this in greater detail, we can also look at it from the regulatory perspective, of course. So here's a regulatory statement, and it's taken from the organic farming certification scheme and prescribes certain obligations on the part of the producer. So producer must establish and maintain preventative livestock healthcare practices. And those, meaning the practices, include the following. And then there's a listing of 3 different points as shown here. And here is the classical example of a regulatory constitutive hybrid. So cases where an object in this particular institutional statement is in fact in its own right a constituted entity that is defined in the very same statement. So that's an example of a regulatory constitutive hybrid. So it exists in both directions and bear similar properties, that the statement in itself is primarily characterized based on the leading statement syntactic classification. That would be a regulatory statement here. But the object decomposition in this particular instance is actually of constitutive character. So if we look at this more specifically and look at it from an idiomatic point of view, looking at the structure, we'll find that we have a general abdico structure with a combination of 2 aims, of course, and objects and corresponding properties. But we'll also see that the direct object, that is the livestock healthcare practices themselves, are actually decomposed into a constitutive statement in its own right. So where the livestock healthcare practices are actually a set of different properties, including the selection of species, provision of feed rations, and the establishment of appropriate housing. So the how do we go about the decomposition of this statement, really? And how, I mean, we can of course code them according to the syntactic components, but in some instances we actually can go further. In fact, we can go as far to decompose those 2 statements into separate statements. And the idea is here that the angle, so the pivotal component is, of course, the constituted entity. So the idea is to identify the entity that's defined as part of the constitutive statement and use this as a reference, basically an anchor between the corresponding regulatory and constitutive statement. So once we do so, we can in principle decompose this institutional statement into 2 statements, where we basically have a regulatory statement, the leading statement, and a separate constitutive statement that only captures the defining and descriptive aspects that are related to the constituted entity. So that's the basic idea here. So we could, the previous statement, practically, we could look at it and encode it, of course, in slightly different terms. So again, here's the view with respect to the identified differentiation into regulatory structure and the constitutive structure. But if we decompose this, we'll end up with those kind of statement structure that's shown here. So the producer must establish and maintain preventative livestock healthcare practices, which in itself is a complete regulatory statement, and a separate statement that suggests that the preventative livestock healthcare practices include the following properties, which is a constitutive statement with the decomposition of the properties, of course, in an unambiguous form and does not, at least at this stage, contain any remnants of the regulatory nature. So the question is, of course, is that why would he apply this practice? And the idea is, again, when the concern is to reconstruct the institutional complexity comprehensively, let alone the institutional configuration comprehensively, we need to be able to identify, again, all the regulated activities on the one hand, but of course all the objects, or rather in this case artifacts or here practices that are embedded as well, and that may well transcend individual institutional statements. That means the livestock healthcare practices may well be referenced across the entire policy in other places. So it's important to identify it here, because in this instance, the policy cannot be read without having this particular statement in mind. Otherwise, the preventative livestock healthcare practices as used elsewhere would not be defined, if not interpreted and extracted from this specific regulatory statement. So this is the basic point about affording such a decomposition to extract complete and comprehensive institutional content. So following this basic motivation and exemplification, if you like, of the idea of the constitutive regulatory hybrids and regulatory constitutive hybrids, if you like, and the corresponding decomposition, which in some cases is possible, in others not so much. We'll get to this in a second. We can also look at another aspect that is related to decomposition, and we'll continue this using this very same example. And here the decomposition simply relates to the provision of a feed ration sufficient to meet nutritional requirements. So we enumerated, we see here in this particular example that the feed ration is decomposed into vitamins, minerals, proteins, and so on, so further different components. And you'll see here that we basically have a, well, nested constitutive statement in its own right, because here within this first order constitutive statement, meaning the statement related to the livestock healthcare practices, we find a nested statement that highlights the feed ration, which in itself is, of course, a constituted entity, and itself is, of course, decomposed into vitamins, minerals, proteins, and so on, further aspects. And again, we can now identify the logical relationship between those and code it accordingly. So this is the motivation of the nested substructure that we'll find in constitutive, but also in regulatory statements, of course, more generally. Having leveraged the characterization as statements not only as constitutive and regulatory, but rather dealing with those in hybrid forms, such as constitutive regulatory hybrids and conversely regulatory constitutive hybrids, depending on the syntactic characterization of the leading statement. We can also observe an opportunity to leverage abstraction from the underlying structure of the institutional statements more generally. And before doing so and exemplifying it, of course, here it's worthwhile revisiting the potential analytical perspective that one may entertain when coding institutional statements. So if we seek to look at institutions or institutional statements in terms of policy as institutions in form that are written and expressed, and we wish to identify and encode them close to source, that is the written text in this particular case, then it's of course very central and important to unambiguously characterize the individual statements and of course the components specifically. And again, it relates to the objective. It's about exploring the structure of a particular policy more specifically, but also possibly considering stylistic aspects such as the preference for example, constitutive statements, since the possible conversion of those statements has been discussed in literature in any case, but it may also relate to the theories that are applied and in which the characterization is important and methodologies that are relevant. On the other hand, if we abstract from the institutions as they're expressed, let's say in policy specifically, and we seek to extract the institutional content as it's used in practice, that is relevant in practice for the purpose of reconstructing the institutional arrangements more comprehensively. We are perhaps not as immediately concerned with the characterization of statements as either constitutive or regulatory in nature, but rather concerned with the unambiguous identification and extraction of relevant concepts, that being, for example, objects or artifacts, and of course, actions for the purpose of analysis. This is can be a slightly varying perspective, but it also means that the emphasis is moving away from the characterization as statements in or characterization of statements either constitutive and regulatory, but looking at it from the analytical lens that one applies. So in this particular case, the characterization may be quite secondary, actually. And what we see and observe, in addition to the differentiation of statements into parts that are of regulatory nature and constitutive nature, if you like, we can also see the opportunity to have a kind of dual annotation for institutional statements, both in terms of constitutive structure as well as in terms of the regulatory syntax. So if we look, for example, for what we're proposing here, especially in the context of constitutive statements, if we find statements that have as embed a functional character within either in the statement itself or in substatements or specific components such as properties and so on, and that can be signaled by action descriptors, both in terms of verbs, activities, but also by conceptual reification. That is the reconstruction of action in terms of, or expression rather, the expression of actions in terms of objects. Or the other aspect is that statements simply lend themselves quite well for expression in regulatory form. And that can often relate to the presence of a particular, of the actor, if you like, so allow the reconstruction of the regulatory nature of a statement. And of course, if it's analytically useful in the first place, that's of course an important prerequisite. Then we suggest that we can that the coders can provide an additional annotation with a subset of the regulatory syntax in addition to the constitutive syntax the statement is annotated with in the first place. Conversely, we propose the opposite. If we have regulatory statements that have in which constitutive components or elements are embedded, that can't be coded as unambiguously and separated unambiguously in let's say, regulatory constitutive hybrid statements, as we saw in the past in previous examples, and whereas, of course, meaning and useful, then we equally suggest in this context that we have an additional annotation with constitutive syntax, well, in addition to the previous regulatory annotation. So what does it mean in practice? Let's look at this statement again. So when we look at this statement from a policy perspective, it is, of course, has constitutive character. Primarily, it suggests the or specifies the functions of the board that shall be as follows. Whereas the functions themselves are expressed in somewhat regulatory character, at least from a bird's eye perspective, in addition to the decomposition of the properties, of course. But here we have a signal of functional aspects, in particular in the property components as they're expressed here. So, and while, for example, in policy and annotated accordingly, the statement would read like this, of course: functions of the board, the function of the board there being the constituted entity, shall being the deontic, and the constituting function being B, and the corresponding properties decomposed as follows. We could also read this in operational terms quite differently, and that is in regulatory form. So you can suggest that the board must give effect to decisions, act as the executive organ, or perform any other function. So what we see here is that we have the same statement, of course, with some reinterpretation, but still retaining the core analytical content, and so the institutional content rather. Here, in fact, that it does not define the functions of the board, but it more explicitly specifies which actions of the board are regulated in the first place, and rather here the obligations of this board in the first place, something you would find in the operational use, of course, in which you, for example, can perform a compliance assessment that could assess in how far the expectations of the board are satisfied. So there is no question that this affords, of course, some reformulation of the statement, that since the different components don't map unambiguously, and that wouldn't be expected since they are, of course, annotated with different syntax. So if we overlay this statement here, which is originally coded as per constitutive syntax with a regulatory syntax, we find now that we are able to retain the relationship and the structure for both statement types. So on the one hand, of course, we characterize the original meaning of the statement in that it defines the function, but we can also relate more explicitly now to the attribute, the actor that is involved in this particular example, and make reference to it, such as the board, which is now annotated as attribute. And where we find the constituting function still annotated as B being annotated as the constituting function, of course, the aim is to give, to act, and to perform respectively as they're embedded in the properties. So we have this blended, seemingly blended annotation of institutional statements more generally, and we consider this a syntactic polymorph. And the reason here is that the statement in principle can take either shape. It can take the shape of a constitutive, or retain rather the shape of the constitutive statement, but also take the shape of a regulatory statement that's just shown in the previous example here. So depending on the perspective that you apply, a selective perspective you apply, you can treat it as either statement. So if you are interested in the analysis by form, of course, it would be treated as a constitutive statement primarily. If you, the interest lies, for example, in a analysis of behavior more specifically, especially if we look at the board here as the attribute, then the expression in regulatory syntax appears sensible because it captures the institutional content while at the same time expressing it in regulatory form and assigning a responsible actor. So in addition to this well-structured example we've previously shown, in some cases is of course less clear-cut and less unambiguous, but perhaps still analytically desirable. And here's an example that captures this to some extent. So if we look at this example, we'll find, of course, that this is of constitutive nature in the first place. And again, in the properties, it contains selected terms, concepts rather, that describes certain characterizations of, in this case, livestock healthcare practices. And however, while they are expressed in terms of concepts, they are actually reflecting activities, of course, right? So anyone who is committing to preventative livestock healthcare practices in this context would select species and types of livestock with regard to suitability and so on. It would provide a feed ration sufficient to meet certain requirements and establish, of course, appropriate housing. So here again, we'll find the concept of conceptual reification, the representation of actions in terms of objects or concepts more generally. And we also find another anomaly here, that we can't even find, or at least we can assume that we can't find a responsible actor, even if we wanted to annotate it. And the idea is here that we still permit the annotation, the partial annotation of institutional statements, for example, in regulatory form, if you like, so as to allow the reconstruction of the complete regulatory statement if an either implied or somehow otherwise resolved actor is identified. So that if such situation were to occur, we could still analyze this statement in regulatory terms without then going about recoding it more explicitly. But this is, of course, a more exceptional case. But in any case, if such observation takes place, such as having a conceptual reification or having an absence of selected components, then the coding in this form is still desirable in the first place. So this concludes the overview of IG Extended. The idea or central point of IG extended, both on the regulatory and constitutive side, is to decompose structure. And that's what IG extended here, of course, did to a great extent. So on the first aspect is, of course, to identify structural patterns that being specifically elaborated with respect to the properties, such as being collections. So we saw various examples for collections where, for example, the functions of a board are composed of certain elements. They can vary in terms of exhaustiveness. So in some instances, enumerations are not exhaustive, and this should be signaled as well, of course. And they can embed substructures, something we briefly touched upon as well. So those constitutive statements can, for example, nest constitutive statements in its own right, and that's very much compatible to the observations we made on the regulatory side, of course. In addition, we have context annotations, but we have not discussed them in any greater detail here because they have been covered on the regulatory side. And the last aspect is the explicit discussion of regulatory constitutive hybrids, as we refer to those. And those are basically statements of either kind that can embed the corresponding other kinds, meaning statements of regulatory nature that include constitutive ones and regulatory ones, or constitutive ones that include regulatory ones, conversely. In addition to this characterization as hybrids, that being statements in which distinct parts of the statements are either of regulatory or constitutive nature, we also introduced the concept of a syntactic polymorph, and that being statements that may either be constitutive or regulatory in kind, but can be reformulated or reconstructed in principle in the corresponding other syntactic structure. So, and in this context, we're suggesting that the annotation can both occur in constitutive terms, but also in regulatory terms, as we just explored before. But again, the prerequisite for applying any of such extension is, of course, that it's analytically desirable and useful. So with this overview, we're turning to IG Logico. So looking back now at the complete picture here, of the levels of expressiveness as they apply for constitutive statements, IG Logico shifts the perspective from structure to semantics, and specifically across the entire statements more generally, or at least the relevant subset thereof. And what we do here is we, of course, introduce additional semantic annotations, and they are in parallel to the ones introduced on the regulatory side. But we also introduce the concept of constituting function types, and I'll get to that in a second to continue this the explicit elaboration on how they actually function and how we can use them in practice. So, but before doing so, I'm representing the constitutive statement more generally here, both with reference to the original syntax, if you like, but also the newly introduced syntax in the bottom, if you like. In terms of its semantics. So as we suggested before, the activation conditions can lead to an activation of a particular expression in the first place, and that generally is the fact that an entity is constituted based on some sort of function that takes properties as its input in the widest sense. Right? So if you think about the function of the board being constituted in a wider sense, they need to take input in the terms of the elementary functions that the board has to perform. So with this in mind, we see the relationship, the semantic relationship between the constituting function, the properties, and of course the entity more specifically, in addition to further constraints that may apply during execution in the form of execution constraints. But the essential point is here that the constituting function ties and links together specifically the properties and the entities, and in some instances, of course, context as well. So they are the linking pin, if you like, when we look at the interpretation of constitutive statements more generally. So if we look at the constituting function, we'll find that literature generally suggests that it's a fixed type. So in the original reference to Seoul that was made in the beginning of this video by Saba, it is represented as an is, so x, s, y in the context Z. For example, representing a particular relationship or the role an individual holds in a particular context. And there are, of course, various refinements, such as by Grossi et al., that have a semantically richer characterization as counts as. So something counts as something else in a particular context, if you like. But even though there are various refinements and suggestions for refinements in literature, they generally point to some sort of default interpretation, if you like, of any of such natures. So we are, of course, interested in capturing the institutional statements from an empirical perspective, and we'll find a much greater diversity in practical use that we, of course, seek to capture in the coding of institutional statements more explicitly. And that's why we are interested in exploring how far we can annotate and then characterize semantically what this constituting function actually does with respect to the associated components. So to do that, we first of all, of course, revisit some of the examples we had earlier. We have certain statements. The first one, for example, suggesting that from the 1st of January onwards, the Connecticut Food Policy Council shall be within the Department of Agriculture, so changing its relationship, in this case, or establishing rather a relationship to the Department of Agriculture. The second statement makes reference to citizens and their rights, so citizens are equal under the law. Food Policy Council may consist of diverse groups, so there's a relationship that suggests that the Food Policy Council contains, if you in widest sense, diverse groups of different kind. And the university plan example at the bottom, in the department's university plan, diverse population must mean diversity in religion, sexual orientation, and race, makes reference to the characterization of the diverse population in the first place, which is the constituted entity in this example. So we'll see, we quickly see here that the constituting function is quite diverse and quite different, and can by no means simply be reduced to either is or counts as, if you like. So we need to capture this somehow. And the idea was there, or the question there rather was, are there particular patterns that we can observe in practice that are more generalizable and that allow us to characterize the constituting function more generally? And of course, there are certain patterns we can observe and that we characterize briefly here. On the highest level, we'll find that constitutive statements specifically make reference to two natural kinds, if you like. On the one hand, they either characterize an entity they define, describe. On the other hand, they can make reference to a policy. So that can be, for example, the description of a document with respect to its life cycle when it comes into force, its relationship to other statements, the intent underlying a particular policy document, and any other further information that may be related. Conversely, on the entity side, we'll find a definition, for example, of an entity as part of a constitutive statements that may include, or may be, well, an actor, for example, a object, role, or an action as it is used in the policy more generally. And this can also occur by outright definition, what it actually means and entails, intentional definition, but also by ascription, if you like, by, for example, characterizing a role by the action it performs. So in addition, we have the composition relationship, the organization relationship, and of course, reference to life cycle aspects of a particular entity. The last aspect relates to the conferral, and that is the assignment, for example, of rights that are conferred or related to individual, and therefore also possibly capturing the representation of authority and indirectly of the institutional power that's embedded therein. So those are some patterns that we see in constitutive statements more generally, and that we, of course, wish to characterize and associate with those more immediately, where possible, in order to capture the semantic content more richly. We'll also find that those statements, or those different characterizations can, in principle, be refined further. For example, we could describe the different types of compositions that we'll find. We can characterize the nature of the relationship within organizations and so on. So there's certain levels of refinements that are conceivable here, but not elaborated in this particular context. Furthermore, of course, we will not claim that this is a finite set of such constituting functions, but rather the idea is to lay those out, lay a baseline characterization out in the first place, so we can start annotating the institutional statements correspondingly and draw some analytical leverage from this. So coming back to the examples we just visited, we can now annotate them comprehensively. So we can suggest that a entity is characterized by the constituting function in the first instance. So that would be the Connecticut Food Policy Council. And that's, of course, an organizational relationship. The second one is a conferral relationship, in which we make reference to the equality of citizens under the law. So it confers certain rights to the individuals, but they are still identified as, of course, entities. The third one composes, or rather, composes the Food Policy Council from different groups of different kinds. So it represents a composition relationship. And the last one is an outright definition of diverse populations, what they mean in the context of the department's university plan. So it again characterizes an entity, that is the diverse population, and a definition associated with this. So continuing those examples, for the policy side, we'll find, of course, selected mappings as well. So the first statement represents a purpose of a particular policy. It suggests that the purpose of this part is to establish standards, where the characterized entity is the policy, and it of course captures the intent. And the second statement makes reference to a relationship between policies, again annotated accordingly. And the last one basically suggests that the policy, does not contain certain provisions, so it's of informational nature in the widest sense. So, with this brief overview on IG Logico specifically, and only one central feature that we find there, the constituting function time specifically, we conclude this overview of the levels of expressiveness and IG 2.0 more generally in the context of constitutive statements. So we have discussed or introduced the original syntax initially, then, or the novel syntax initially, of course, that we built the discussion upon, and then extended the characterization based on the different levels. So initially, of course, by borrowing the characteristics on IG core that we'll also find in the regulatory side, that is particularly the association of properties and nesting characteristics. Then we further explored the decomposition of structure on IG extended, and of course the semantic perspective on logical level. So, but if you look at the this overview here, it is sensible and also timely to relate it back to the regulatory side of the institutional grammar in the widest sense. So we see here in relative congruence, if you like, representation of the regulatory side on top, the Abdico schema in a way, and in the bottom, of course, the newly introduced Petfico structure. And we can clearly see the overlap between different components, for example, the context, so here the activation conditions and execution constraints specifically, as well as the or else's, which vary slightly in terms of selected semantic aspects, but see otherwise also the difference between those different syntax representations. So while the deontic is to some extent overlapping, of course, the properties, the constituted entity, and the aim and constituting function respectively are different from the regulatory corresponding elements on the regulatory side. So drawing on this linkage relationship, we'll see also that we, of course, have a correspondence with respect to the different coding levels, and also the focal aspects that those entertain on those particular levels. So being, again, IG extended, looking at structure, logical, into the semantics of the corresponding statements more specifically. So this is basically the conclusion of this overview of constitutive statements in IG 2.0. So the central aspects that we want to leave the listener with is that we introduced a new syntax that is empirically observed clearly. So even though it has certain novel features and particular syntactic components, we can all find those in coding practice. The second aspect is that it really seeks to harmonize the regulatory and constitutive side of statements. And we recognize, of course, that constitutive statements vary from regulatory statements considerably, specifically with respect to scope, where, for example, regulatory statements are generally embedded within a given action situation. This may not be the case for constitutive statements that whose effect may survive beyond a particular action situation and perhaps throughout the policy more generally. I mean, that's an expected characterization if we find that constitutive statements are often found in preambles of policy documents more generally, or dedicated parts in the first place. So here the question is rather one of scope that needs to be put forth when identifying the analytical objectives that the coding exercise underlies. So if we're looking at individual statements, of course, this is a different perspective as opposed to looking at the policy in its entirety. There's, of course, a certain overlap that I just highlighted based on the juxtaposition of both different syntax specifications, particularly with respect to the context and associated taxonomies, as well as the OLs. But we also introduced the hybrids that actually literally reconciliate the characterizations you find in practice, but also showcase in how far aspects of constitutive statements can be expressed in regulatory terms, and conversely, where we can now capture the constitution of particular entities, if you like, that's embedded and somewhat hidden from the coder in some instances in regulatory statement, and make those explicit as well. So the constitutive regulatory hybrids are the main vehicle to facilitate this opportunity. And the last aspect is, of course, to do a encoding as a syntactic polymorph. So the idea is that statements can be leveraged from both the regulatory side as well as constitutive side, where analytically useful. So that's the last refinement that also aims at integrating or at least harmonizing the perspective of regulatory and constitutive statement. But it of course also invites for a congruence of coding. So in IG 2.0, it's no longer sensible to forego the coding in principle of the constitutive or regulatory side. In some way or another, it can or should be considered, and now the specification offers the opportunity to do so in congruence. That means we can, for example, encode regulatory statement in IG extended and can now equally decompose structure for constitutive statements as well. So, but again, and as always, for all cases and all the features that have been introduced in this video series in IG2, of course, more generally, the use needs to correspond to analytical needs. That's a fundamental and central point, because we understand and appreciate that the feature set that is introduced is rather rich and diverse in nature. But again, it needs to correspond to what the fundamental analytical objectives are. And at this stage, all that is left is to thank you for paying attention to this rather extensive overview on the constitutive statements in IG 2.0.